Hello, everybody. The program we're seeing tonight it's been a long time coming. I've been interested in the storm of 1913 for a long time. I've written a lot of articles about it. But one thing you have to bear in mind, when these ships were found, the ones we're going to look at tonight, they were found in the 1970s. And in the 1970s, the condition in the lake was entirely different than what it is today. It was pitch black. Visibility was measured in inches. That was in the 70s when these two ships were found. Well, in the 1990s, zebra mussels, one way or another, got into the Great Lakes, and everything changed. All of a sudden, visibility was measured in feet, hundreds of feet. You could see the entire ship from one end to the other. And what that was enabled you to do was to see the actual conditions of these ships and what caused them to sink. And that's been a puzzle since the storm of 1913. We really didn't know what caused these ships to sink. Now, the storm was unprecedented. It was the biggest natural calamity in the history of the Great Lakes. The center of it was right over where we are now. It was in the middle of Lake Huron. The highest winds were recorded at Harbor Beach of 91 miles an hour. The waves, they averaged 35 feet and higher out in the middle of the lake. This storm was more like a weather explosion than any storm that had ever been encountered on the Great Lakes before. No one knew the extent of the damage because there was no communication between the ships. There was no radio. They couldn't contact the land, or they couldn't contact other ships. So for several days actually, people didn't know the extent and the amount of damage that was caused by this storm. And then the bodies started washing ashore. First in ones and twos, and then by dozens, and then whole lifeboats filled with crew members. And the other thing you have to remember is none of them died from drowning. They all died from exposure. Every single one died from freezing to death, being held afloat by those crummy cork life preservers they used in those days. So when navigation did start on the lakes again a few days later, the first ships out on the lake reported a shocking sight. They saw a full-size steel freighter floating upside down. I mean, this had never happened on the Great Lakes before. In fact, you're hard-pressed to find something like this happening on the ocean. A fully intact freighter floating upside down. What could have caused this? Of course, the newspapers went crazy with speculation. All the authorities in the marine field chimed in on it, and they tried to identify what ship it was. And they thought, the theory was that the only way this could have happened would have been in a collision. Two ships had to have collided out in the lake for this to happen. So as days went on, they still couldn't identify the ship. They were going by the colors that it was painted, by the dimensions of the hull. Some people that should have known better were guessing what it could be. Finally, the Lake Carriers Association, William Livingston was the president, he offered a $100 reward. Now, $100 in 1913 was $4,000 in our money today, so it was a pretty good sum for 1913. A diver from Detroit, his name was William Baker, said that he would attempt to locate the name on the ship if they would provide him a tug to get out to it and a crew to work with. So he came up from Detroit by train, came to Port Huron. They hired this tug Sport, which a lot of divers are familiar with because it ended up on the bottom too off Port Sanilac, not through this storm. But they took the tug Sport out with the Thompson tug from the Thompson Tug Company. They anchored over the floating hull. Now, this was an extremely dangerous dive because when a hard hat diver went on a wreck like this, he was usually lowered down by a crane. He would stand on a platform and the crane would lower him down. Well, they didn't have any of that out on this tug, so what they did was they lashed a ladder to the stern of the tug. He climbed down to the bottom rung and then jumped off. Now, this was more close to a spacewalk than actually diving because all he was depending on was this thin metal tether and his air hose to keep him from plunging to the bottom. So when he was in the water, dangling off the stern of the tug, they maneuvered the tug over close to the overturned hull. And then by a series of hand signals, he got them to lower him down, and he found his way along the railing that actually encircled the foredeck. And he managed to find the bow where the name was, And he saw where the name was painted on the bow, and he traced it with his hands a couple of times to memorize it because it was upside down and basically backwards in your way of thinking. So when he was satisfied that he had gotten the name, he maneuvered forward and examined the bow to see if there was any indication of a collision, and there wasn't. The bow was perfect. So he signaled to be brought up. They brought him back up on the deck of the tug, and they unscrewed the metal faceplate that was on his diving helmet. And with a crowd of reporters standing around him, they said, "What ship is it?" And his words were words that will be ever in Great Lakes history. He said, "Pay me my $100 first." So they made arrangements to pay him. And then he said, and his exact words were, "It's one of the big boys." He said, "It's the price." And that was like a shock wave that went through the Marine community, because that was one of the largest and the newest. It was only 2 years old. So they figured if that could happen to a ship the size of the Price, then what chance did all the other ones have? So then they were pretty resigned. Even though the other ships had just totally disappeared and they didn't know where any of them were, they felt that they must have all met the same fate as the Price. So the Charles Price was left now that all the fanfare had died down, and it floated for 10 days before it finally sank. And for all intents and purposes, it was gone from the history books. 3 years later, World War I was raging in Europe. The demand for iron ore, limestone, and grain was just at an all-time high. Anything that could float was worth a fortune. So the Marine men remembered, here's this brand new freighter, 2 years old, intact, lying in the bottom of Lake Huron, and we know where it is. Not like any of the other ships, they had no clue where they were. So they sent out 2 tugs with a cable, and they found it, and then they sent for this boat, the tug Favorite. The Great Lakes Towing Company had just built this boat 2 years before. It was a monster. It was built for salvaging on the Great Lakes. It was 200 feet long, 50 feet wide. It had capacity for a crew of 100 if it was needed. So they sent it out and anchored it over where they knew the overturned hull of the Price was. Now the theory was that they were going to drill holes in the Price's hull, pump it full of air, and float it again. And this was possible because it had been done, not to an overturned ship, but it had been done before. And it would be a pretty easy job with a ship the size of the Favorite to work with. So they began lowering divers down. They drilled holes in the hull. The protocol was to get it up just below the surface, and then they would tow it into shallower water and then roll it over with a series of winches and anchors. And then when it was rolled over upright, then they were going to refloat it. So they began drilling holes in it and attaching these air compressor hoses, because the ship Favorite had 2 huge air compressors on it. And they began slowly filling the overturned hull with air. And they actually got the bow up, as you can see in this illustration. They got the bow up off the bottom, but the stern refused to budge. So they sent divers down to examine the stern area, thinking it was just possibly stuck into the mud or the silt in the bottom. And when the diver came back up, he said, you wouldn't believe it. He said, the stern is squashed flat, like somebody squeezed out a toothpaste. There's no way they could get it to hold air to pump it up, and that's why it was still lying on the bottom. So here was this ship, almost 75% of it intact without a scratch on it, and then the stern crushed flat. And this was a puzzle. No one could figure out how that could have happened. So that's what the video we're going to see tonight is going to show, how that actually did happen to these ships that sank in the 1913 storm. So Chris and Mike.